There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a house when the last child leaves. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of rest. It is something heavier than both of those. A silence that has weight and texture, that presses against the walls of rooms that used to be full of noise, of argument, of laughter, of the beautiful, exhausting chaos of a life lived alongside other people. Grace Okonkwo knew that silence well. She had been anticipating it for years, the way you anticipate a storm on the horizon, watching it come, knowing it is coming, telling yourself you are prepared, and then discovering, when it finally arrives, that you were not prepared at all. Her youngest, Emeka, left for Abuja on a Tuesday morning in October. He had a new job, a government posting, the kind of opportunity that a mother spends 20 years praying for, and then spends the morning of his departure trying not to cry about. Grace stood at the gate of their compound in Enugu, watched his taxi until it turned the corner and disappeared, and then walked back into her house. She was 60 years old. Her husband, Chike, had died 4 years earlier. A heart attack, sudden, no warning. The kind of death that doesn't give you time to say the things you meant to say. Their 3 children were grown and scattered, Adaora in London, Nkechi in Lagos, and now Emeka in Abuja. The house that had once held all 5 of them, that had been loud and warm and perpetually disorganized, was now hers alone. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the walls, and for the first time in 40 years of mothering, of wifehood, of building and sustaining and holding together a family, Grace Okonkwo did not know what to do next. She was not, by any measure, a woman who had lived a small life. She had trained as a nurse in the 1980s, worked for 15 years at the University of Nigeria Teaching Hospital, raised 3 children largely on her own, while Chike's engineering career kept him traveling, managed the finances of a household that was often tight, often stretched, occasionally genuinely frightening in its precarity. She had buried her mother, nursed her father through his final years, organized 2 weddings for her daughters, and survived the particular grief of a husband's sudden death with a dignity that her children, watching her, had found both admirable and faintly worrying. She had always been the one who held things together, the one who knew where everything was, the one people called when they needed something done. But now there was nothing to hold together, nothing to manage, no one calling. The children called, of course, Adaora on Sundays, Nkechi on Wednesdays, Emeka whenever he remembered, which was often enough. They were good children. They checked on her. They asked how she was doing, and she told them she was fine, because she was fine, mostly, in the way that a person can be fine and also quietly disappearing at the same time. She had developed, without noticing, a very small life. She woke at 7. She made tea. She watched the morning news. She went to the market on Tuesdays and Fridays, not because she needed much, but because it gave her somewhere to go. She attended church on Sundays and sat in the 4th pew from the front, the same pew she had sat in for 30 years, and sang the hymns she had always sung, and shook hands with the people she had always known, and drove home alone. She cooked full meals for one person and ate half of them. She went to bed at 9. She was not suffering, exactly. She was not in crisis. She was simply waiting. Waiting in the way of someone who has finished one long chapter and cannot find the beginning of the next. Waiting in the way of someone who has stopped, without meaning to, believing that there is a next chapter at all. This went on for 8 months. The decision, when it came, arrived in the most ordinary way imaginable. It was a Thursday afternoon. Grace was sitting on the veranda, doing nothing in particular, not reading, not watching anything, just sitting in the way she had taken to doing, looking out at the compound without really seeing it, when her neighbor, Mrs. Eze, appeared at the gate. Mrs. Eze was 72, small and relentlessly energetic, a woman who seemed to run on a fuel source unavailable to ordinary people. She was carrying a large bag and wearing the expression of someone who has just had an excellent idea and cannot wait to share it. "Grace," she said, letting herself in without being invited, which was her habit. "I need a favor." The favor was this. Mrs. Eze ran an informal health clinic out of her sitting room on Thursday afternoons. She had been doing it for years, ever since she retired from the civil service and found, like Grace, that retirement had left a hole in her days. She helped people in the neighborhood manage their blood pressure medications, checked on the elderly, kept a basic record of who was taking what and when. It was not official, it was not particularly organized, but it was something. Her usual helper had traveled for a funeral. Could Grace come and assist? Just for this one afternoon? Grace almost said no. She could feel the no forming in her mouth, the polite deflection she had become practiced at over these 8 months, the gentle withdrawal from anything that required her to be present and useful and part of the world. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She was the kind of tired that comes from a long time of not being needed. But she looked at Mrs. Eze's face, the expectation there, the simple, uncomplicated assumption that Grace was the right person for this, that of course she would come, that her skills were wanted. And something in her, something that had been very quiet for a very long time, woke up. "Let me get my bag," Grace said. She had not intended it to change her life. She had intended to help for one afternoon and go home and return to her quiet routine. That was the plan. That was what she told herself as she walked the short distance to Mrs. Eze's sitting room, bag in hand, feeling slightly foolish and slightly nervous in a way she hadn't expected. But the moment she sat down across from the first patient, an elderly man named Mazi Obi, 78 years old, with hypertension and the air of someone who had been managing his own medication by guesswork for years, something shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no thunderclap, no sudden revelation, no moment of cinematic clarity. It was something quieter than that. It was the feeling of a key turning in a lock she had forgotten was there. She took his blood pressure. She asked him about his medications. She listened to the way he described his symptoms, and she heard, beneath the words, the particular anxiety of an old man who does not quite trust his own body anymore and does not have anyone to help him understand what is happening inside it. She explained things. She answered questions. She was patient in the unhurried way of someone who has nowhere else to be. When he left, he shook her hand with both of his and thanked her in a way that made her throat tighten. There were 11 more patients that afternoon. Grace went home at 7 p.m., made herself tea, and sat at the kitchen table. She was tired, but it was the right kind of tired, the kind that comes from having used yourself fully, from having been present and useful and genuinely needed. It was the tiredness of a person who has done something that matters. She had not felt that in 8 months. She called Mrs. Eze at 8 o'clock. "I'll come back next Thursday," she said, "if you still want me." "I was hoping you'd say that," Mrs. Eze said. What followed was not a sudden transformation. Grace was 60 years old, and she had lived long enough to be suspicious of sudden transformations. Life, in her experience, changed not in great dramatic leaps, but in small, consistent steps, like the way the harmattan comes, not all at once, but gradually, the air getting a little drier each day until one morning you wake up and the whole world is dust and haze, and you wonder how you didn't notice it arriving. The clinic on Thursday afternoons became a fixture. Then she started going on Tuesday mornings, too. Then she began making home visits to elderly patients in the neighborhood who could not easily leave their houses, checking on them, monitoring their conditions, sitting with them for a while, because sometimes what a person needs most is not medical, but simply human. Word spread, as it always does in Nigerian neighborhoods, through the invisible but highly efficient network of people talking to other people. There was a nurse, they said, a real nurse, retired from UNTH. She came to your house. She actually listened. She didn't rush you. By the end of the first year, Grace had a list of 47 regular patients. She was not charging money, not at first, not officially. But people brought things: yams from a farm in the village, bags of rice, cooked food left at her gate. The economy of gratitude that operates in communities where formal payment feels wrong, but doing nothing feels worse. Her daughter Nkechi, visiting from Lagos, walked into the house one Saturday morning to find it temporarily converted into a waiting room. 4 elderly neighbors sitting on chairs that had been arranged along the wall, her mother moving between them with a confidence and purpose that Nkechi had not seen in years. "Mummy," Nkechi said, pulling her aside, "what is all this?" "I'm working," Grace said simply, and went back to her patients. Nkechi stood in the hallway for a moment, watching her mother through the doorway. Then she sat down on the stairs and quietly, so no one would hear, cried. Not from sadness, from relief. The thing Grace had not expected, the thing that surprised her more than any of the practical developments, was what the work did to her sense of time. In those 8 months of quiet, time had moved strangely. The days had been both long and featureless, stretching out with the kind of shapeless endlessness that she had found, without quite admitting it, terrifying. When every day looks the same, and none of them contain anything that could not have happened yesterday, or will not happen again tomorrow, you begin to feel that you are not moving through time so much as standing still inside it. Now time had texture again. There were days she looked forward to. There were patients she thought about between visits, running through their situations in her mind, considering whether the medication was working, whether the symptoms she'd noticed warranted a proper hospital visit. There were problems to solve. There were people who would be, in some small but real way, better or worse depending on whether she showed up. She started reading again. Medical journals mostly, trying to update herself, to close the gap of the years since she had practiced formally. She discovered that medicine had moved considerably since the 1990s, that there were new protocols and new understandings and new approaches to conditions she had spent years treating the old way. She found this fascinating rather than daunting. She was a quick study. She had always been a quick study. She started sleeping better. She started cooking full meals and eating them. She started calling her children instead of waiting for them to call her, not out of loneliness, but because she had things to tell them, things that had happened, people she had met, problems she had solved. Her children noticed. They did not say anything directly. This was not a family that said things directly, but they noticed. Emeka, calling from Abuja one Sunday evening, said, "You sound different, Mummy." "Do I?" she said. "You sound like yourself," he said. She did not say anything for a moment. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I do." In the second year, she registered the clinic properly. It was Adora, the daughter in London, who pushed her toward it. Adora was a solicitor, precise and practical, and she had been watching her mother's informal operation with equal parts admiration and concern. "You're doing real medical work, Mummy," she said on one of their Sunday calls. "You should do it properly. Protect yourself. Make it official." The process was not simple. There was paperwork, as there always is in Nigeria, mountains of it, forms that required other forms, offices that sent you to other offices. There were moments when Grace sat across from a bored civil servant who looked at her with the particular skepticism reserved for elderly women attempting things they were not expected to attempt, and she felt the old tiredness rising, the desire to go home, to give up, to return to the quiet. She did not go home. She went back the next day and the day after that. She brought the right papers. She answered the questions. She was patient and persistent, in the unhurried way that had always been her strength. The Grace Okonkwo Community Health Initiative was registered on a Wednesday afternoon in March, in the 3rd year of her retirement. She called Mrs. Eze on the way home. "We're official," she said. "We were always official," Mrs. Eze said. "Now we just have the paper to prove it." The clinic now serves 112 registered patients. It operates 4 days a week. 2 trained volunteers assist Grace on the busiest days. A small grant from a Lagos-based foundation, secured with considerable effort and the help of a young woman named Chisom, who appeared one day asking if she could do her public health attachment there, has funded the purchase of proper medical equipment and a supply of basic medications that are dispensed at no cost to patients who cannot afford them. Grace is 63 years old. She wakes at 6. She makes tea. She reviews her patient notes from the previous day. She is at the clinic by 8. She looks, to anyone who does not know the story, like a woman in the middle of her career. Purposeful, unhurried, completely at home in what she is doing. It would not occur to you, watching her, that this woman spent 8 months sitting on a veranda not knowing what to do next. That she had, for a period, genuinely believed that her most useful years were behind her. She does not believe that anymore. She talks about it sometimes when younger women ask her, and they do ask her, the nurses and health workers and women in their 40s and 50s who come to her with the particular anxiety of people who can see a chapter ending and do not know what comes next. She does not give them a formula. She is skeptical of formulas. Life, in her experience, does not move according to formulas. But she tells them this: the mistake I made was waiting to feel ready, waiting to feel like myself again before I did anything. But that is backwards. You do not feel like yourself and then act. You act, and the acting is what brings you back to yourself. The doing is the medicine. You have to begin before you are ready, because you will never be ready, not in the way you are imagining. The readiness comes after, not before. She pauses there, in the way of someone who has thought about something long enough to have arrived at the simplest version of it. One decision, she says. That is all it takes. One decision to say yes when everything in you wants to say no. One decision to pick up your bag and walk out the door. You don't need to know where it leads. You just need to take the first step. On the morning of her 63rd birthday, her 3 children surprised her. Adora flew in from London. Nkechi drove up from Lagos. Emeka took the early morning bus from Abuja and arrived at the gate of the clinic at 7:30, a full hour before it opened, carrying a cake in a box that had been slightly damaged by the journey, but was still, he insisted, perfectly good. They stood together in the small room that served as the clinic's waiting area. 4 plastic chairs, a table with a vase of artificial flowers, a notice board covered in health information leaflets, and sang happy birthday in the slightly off-key way of people who are more moved than they are musical. Grace looked at her 3 children. She looked at the room around her, at the notice board, the chairs, the box of medical supplies in the corner, the register on the table with 112 names in it. She thought about the Tuesday she had sat on the veranda and looked at the walls and did not know what came next. She thought about Mrs. Eze appearing at the gate with her bag and her excellent idea. She thought about Mazi Obi shaking her hand with both of his. She thought about how close she had come to saying no, how easy it would have been to say no, how completely different everything would be if she had. She cut the cake. The first patient arrived at 8 o'clock while they were still eating. Grace wiped her hands, smiled at her children, and stood up. There was work to do. There was always now work to do. And she was grateful for every last bit of it.